Well, Dr. Clark here again, and today we're going to finish up ecology by talking about community ecology. So we talked about population ecology and demography and things like that, and now we're going to take those components and kind of merge them into the way in which we study communities. And so community ecology is fairly important, especially in today's setting, where we have climate changes and a lot of endangered species and deforestation, habitat destruction, lots of human-induced changes in the environment. We're not just interested in how that affects a single individual population of, say, snowshoe hare, but rather how does it affect the entire group of organisms within a given region. So we'll come back and we'll look at this, but this is a predator-prey model, the lynx hare model. And you can see from this model, you can see that as the lynx population goes up, the hare population goes down, as you would expect. Lynx eat the hare, okay, that population goes down. So you can see here that the hare population spikes, and right after the spike of the hare population, there's normally a spike of lynx that follows. So hare population increases by a lot. The lynx increase to consume the hares because there's lots of nutrients. They can produce more babies. There's a lot more food. And then the hare population crashes. The lynx population crashes. Hare rises, etc., etc., etc. So it's a fairly good fit. Okay? And this works great on things that are specialists, like lynx in this region are specialists on snowshoe hares. Had we examined a different region, a different community ecology, it wouldn't be as nice as this, because maybe the lynx in different regions would eat more than just snowshoe hares. Maybe they eat other types of rabbits, or maybe they would eat, some ground nesting birds and things like that to supplement their diet, so it wouldn't be as nice a fit. But nonetheless, when you're just examining the community, in this case the predator-prey dynamics, sometimes you get these nice models that fit one another and are highly predictive. Alright, so a community, like we talked about before when we talked about community ecology, it's the number of species, all the populations within a given region, and how they interact with each other. Now, like I said before, when we were talking early on about the redwood community, the community is normally distinguished or determined by some kind of dominant species. So what's the primary dominant species in that community? That's what the community is going to be called, and that's the characteristics that are going to determine the community itself. Okay? Now, can that change? Of course. You change that by having changes to the habitat, the temperature, the moisture, the soil. Okay, those four components: sunlight, soil, moisture, and temperature. That's going to determine what can grow. That's going to determine what dictates your community, which also determines what species are going to be available to live in that community. We're often interested not just in being able to say, okay, that's a community, but what's the interactions? What is going on in the community? What produces the nutrients are the primary producers, what consumes those primary producers, what consumes those individuals, etc., etc., etc. And those kind of interactions, so food web interactions, but also, is there interactions from a parasitism? So are there parasites, and what role do the parasites play? Is there an interaction from mutualism or commensalism? So do organisms help each other out? These kind of things. Okay. And so all of that plays a big role in determining nutrient cycles or food webs and these kind of things that would dictate what's going on in a community. Okay, so here's a good example. So we might examine a watering hole, okay, in Tanzania, and you might see a bunch of organisms that are consuming plants. So there's a lot of plant habitat. So these are the primary producers, these different trees and foliage. things like that. And then you have things like zebras and water buffalo or Cape buffalo, giraffes, okay, other things that are in this region consuming those plants. So those are the primary consumers. You even have some birds like stilts and things like that that might be eating insects. The insects are also eating the plants. So the birds would be secondary consumers. But then what role do the predators play? So you have predators like lions and things like that that would come into the community, and they're going to play that secondary or tertiary consumer. And what role? And then what role do things like organisms that might be occupying the region, what role do they play in helping some of these other individuals avoid predation? So here you can see some monkeys that are also visiting the watering hole with this giraffe. And monkeys are known to be very good at alarming other organisms of predators or disturbances. So often monkeys will sound an alarm, and all the organisms that are watering hole would react to that. And so that's a way of showing mutualism. So all organisms benefit. The monkeys are allowed to consume the water and sit around, but they're also sounding a call that every organism recognizes as kind of a predator call, and all organisms will leave. So there are two views that kind of make up community ecology. Two, and I don't want to say competing views, but they're a little bit different from each other, different ways of examining a community. The first one was put up by H.A. Glilson, and that is that a community itself is you should examine it from the individualistic concept or individualistic view. In other words, the community is nothing more than the organisms that occupy that given area. Okay? So there's no overarching whole organism. You can't think of a community itself as being viable, because you can remove a piece from that community and it'll still stay. Okay? Versus the F.E. Clement's point of view, and he suggests that communities are a lot more than just a group of organisms in the same given region, a bunch of different species in the same given region, but it's a holistic concept or holistic idea, in that a community itself is a superorganism. And if you remove one individual, one species from the community, you change the entire community. Okay? Now you might still have a community, but it's a different community than you originally had, okay? Because they're all integrated, and you have things like mutualism, commensalism, parasitism going on within the community, and you need to think of the entire community as a superorganism. So it depends on what view individuals have on how they are going to regulate communities. So if you're individualistic view, then it doesn't matter if a single species is lost to the community. If you're holistic view, every single species is just as important as the other, and without those, you wouldn't have that superorganism. Well, part of that goes into what we call niche or niche competition. So a niche is the abiotic, so the non-living, and the living aspects to a single place in the environment. So where an organism can occupy, that's considered their niche. Okay? So that would be dictated by temperature, moisture, soil, sunlight, what other organisms are present, food, all these microhabitat information, that all determines where the organism can exist, and that's their niche. The word niche comes from a old English term for when individuals, rocksmiths or masons, would build things, chimneys, okay, inside a house like a fireplace. They would leave a brick out. Typically they leave two, one on each side to match, one on the right side, one on the left side. They'd leave a brick out of the fireplace, okay? And it would create this little hole, which they called a niche. In that niche you could stick, matches or striker or other things into that hole, and that's where, where you'd have kind of a place for those kind of utensils. Okay? And that's where the term niche came from. And it's a nice term for biological point of view also, because it's really a specialized region or a specialized area that only one organism can occupy at a given time. Which brings us to competition. If only a single organism can occupy a niche at a given time, then you're going to have competition for those niches. Okay? And so two organisms that might want to occupy the same niche will have to fight for it, will have to either divide the niche, they'll have to do something, okay? Because no two organisms can occupy the same niche. Okay? You can have competition from an interspecific competition, and that's between different species. Okay? So different species that occupy similar niches would have interspecific competition. Or you can have intraspecific competition, and that's going to be between the same species, just two individuals within that same species. Okay? So a lot of this comes about, and when niches were first discovered, we started to really examine niches from a point of view of there are two types of niches out there. You have a fundamental niche. The fundamental niche is all the places that an organism could occupy. So theoretically, they could occupy it. So the temperature, the sun, the precip, okay, the soils, whatever it might be in that region, allow the organism to occupy that region. That's the fundamental niche. So basically, it's all the places on the planet where that single organism could occupy. The realized niche is the actual place that that organism can occupy or is occupying. Okay? Now the difference between the two is that realized niche take into account competition. Are there other organisms that have the same fundamental niche, okay, but they're better at that fundamental niche? They are better at excluding individuals from that fundamental niche. So the realized niche is the actual place that the organism occupies. Take, for example, two different types of barnacles. Okay? So barnacles, they're going to be attached to the rock surface, and they're filter feeding at this point. Okay? So water comes in, they take nutrients out of the water, okay? They grow, reproduce, etc. Okay? Two separate barnacles. Now, we can look at one, the Semibanalis, okay, and we can look at its fundamental niche. So Semibanalis' fundamental niche is identical to its realized niche. But if we look at Thamalthes, okay, Thamalthes is a different species of barnacle, much smaller, can be displaced easier by Semibanalis. Okay. The Thamalthes barnacle, its fundamental niche is the entire region. Okay? So this is like a rock surface sticking out of the water. So Thamalthes could go deeper, okay? But they can't because of the presence of the Semibanalis barnacles. And so their realized niche is much smaller than their fundamental niche. Okay? And that's due to competition. Now, we know this occurs because if we remove Semibanalis, okay, the Thamalthes increases its range. Okay, and it will go deeper until it reaches its maximum which is similar to the maximum of semibanalis. Okay? And there's been a lot of research about competition, or what we call niche competition, and its role in determining where organisms are in a given region. Okay? A lot of work by Goss demonstrated this competitive exclusion that I was just talking about, or the principle of competitive exclusion. Okay? And this is actually where the term of no two organisms can occupy the same niche at the same time really comes from. Okay? And so he examined lots of species, but he examined species in competition around resources. And that resource could be food, it could be space, it could be water, it could be nesting habitat. It's a resource that is limited in the environment. Okay? And he determined that no two species can occupy that same niche. So there has to be some kind of give and take. In some cases, it's competition and one group is excluded and the other one has to either retreat, okay, or has the niche and the other one excluded from that niche, or in some cases they occupy half of the niche, okay, and that will lead to what we call resource partitioning, okay, and we'll come back to that. So another example of this is we can take Paramecium. Paramecium are little aquatic protozoan organisms, and there are quite a few different types, and we can stick them into a bath of water with nutrients and things like that, and we can look at their populations, and their populations fit the sigmoidal graphs. Okay, so the population starts off small, eventually it reaches carrying capacity, levels off. Okay, so Aurelia, we can do that with that. We can do it with Caudatum. Okay, and the same thing. You get the same thing. You can do it with Brucera. Okay, same different thing. Or population is a little bit smaller, but same thing. Sigmoidal graph reaches carrying capacity and levels off. Now, what happens when we put them together? Okay? So if you put Caudatum and Aurelia together, Aurelia, okay, wins out. Okay? It outcompetes Caudatum completely. Caudatum goes extinct in the population. That's true competition, competitive exclusion. Okay? On the other hand, if you put Buceria and Caudatum together, they both reach carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is much less than what they were reaching previously. They're close to 150, so it's about half of what they were. But they both can coexist at carrying capacity. And that means that they do what we call resource partitioning. Okay? So Caudatum gets one region and Buceria gets another region. Okay? So often when we examine communities, communities will work themselves out in the sense that competition is only good for a little bit of time, especially competitive exclusion is only good for a little bit of time. Okay? It's often a waste of energy to compete and lose. So what will happen is species will try to avoid competition at all costs. Okay? So they'll try to either occupy a region in which the other organism is not occupying at the given time, so they can avoid competition, or they leave the region altogether. So when niches overlap, and you have the same niches, most of the time you either will have competitive exclusion, where the winner takes all, or you have resource partitioning, where the resources are divided so you create two niches. Okay? So again, sustained competition over a long period of time rarely happens in natural communities because it's extremely expensive, energetically speaking. Okay? Energetically speaking, to occupy the same niche as another individual and not overwhelm them, exclude them, or not partition the resource, it just creates fighting and a waste of energy. So you'll often see in natural communities, it's either competitive exclusion, so one organism wins, the other one retreats and is excluded from the region, or resource partitioning. And it can lead to extinction of one individual. Okay? Otherwise, it could lead to a kind of a natural break or two niches being created between the organisms. And so here you can see an example of resource partitioning. So if we go to tropical regions and we can examine it like a tropical tree of some sort, we can start examining the different regions of the tree, and you can examine, say, the canopy of the tree, and you might find this Anolis species, right, which is kind of blue and green, and kind of matches the canopy. And then you can examine the trunk of the tree, and you might find this Anolis species, which would be brown and match the trunk of the tree. And then you can examine the grassy areas around, and you might find this species. And then you might find another tree has this species of Anolis. And so this is all resource partitioning. Okay? So these Anolis lizards have the ability to avoid competition by occupying small regions of the different types of trees or vegetation in the area. So resource partitioning, kind of talked about that. Now resource partitioning can happen in a couple different ways. It can happen from a sympatric speciation event, or an area in which the organisms are not divided. Okay? So they occupy the exact same habitat, okay? Like the Anolis species that I just talked about. Okay? That's a sympatric species. Okay? They occupy the same habitat. There's nothing really dividing them. There's no mountain range or anything like that. They could occupy the same region as each other. They just don't. Okay? They partition the region out. That's very different than what we call allopatric species, where they occupy the same niche, but there's something that divides them. Maybe there's a river that divides them. Maybe there's a mountain that divides them. Something divides those two species. So they actually live in same niches, and they could be swapped. You could move one species over the mountain to the other side, and they would occupy the same niche. But due to either a mountain range, river, roadway, something, there's some barrier that separates those two habitats. So those two are kind of different, but can result in the same resource partitioning. It's avoiding competition. One is avoided by the species partitioning the resources themselves, and another one is divided by geographic area partitioning it. So some ecological, geographical event, a river, road, whatever it might be, partitioning that out. Now, when this occurs, you can get features, morphology and physiology, that differs. So if if we go back to this picture here, the lizards, you can see that the morphology of these lizards are very different. Okay? None of them look identical to each other. And that's what can occur when you get resource partitioning. When an organism has to occupy or is occupying a different niche or a different part of the original niche, then it will often have some selective pressure on it. So if the organism doesn't match that background, then maybe it would be consumed by more predators. So it's advantageous for the individuals that are reproduced, that match the background. They're going to survive. They're going to have a distinct advantage. And so in all cases, you could get some evolutionary change that goes along with the resource partitioning. And that kind of brings us to things like coevolution. So coevolution is an interesting concept in itself, in that organisms have the capability to interact with other organisms and adapt to other organisms or adapt to competition or living with other organisms. So if you're always in competition with another species for the same niche, and you're an organism and you've evolved in an advantage, then either this organism over here that's now at the disadvantage develops a mutation and evolves and is still able to compete with you, or that organism goes extinct. And so coevolution is kind of this evolutionary arms race, and things go back and forth, to kind of keep up in competition. And there's lots of examples of this. Right? Classic examples of pollinators. So the fact that a flower really would like an insect to just pollinate it and doesn't really want to return anything to the insect. Okay? So the nectar that a flower produces, it's producing that to attract insects to it. But if the flower can prevent the insect from taking the nectar, then the flower keeps its energy. Okay? The flower is creating that nectar, it's creating that sugar. So if the pollen tube, okay, is deeper than the proboscis of the insect, then the insect will visit the flower, stick its proboscis down, but not reach the nectar. Okay? But the insect will at the same time pollinate the flower. Okay? The insect, on the other hand, would like to visit the flower without getting down into the flower and stick its proboscis in, take a sugar meal, and leave as quick as possible so it can go to the next one and keep consuming. So this is an evolutionary arms race. Pollen tubes get longer, insect proboscis gets longer, okay, or different size or something along those ranges. Okay? Predator-prey, same thing. Predators want to consume prey, prey don't want to be consumed. Prey develop things like camouflage or a distaste, poison glands, venom, okay, toxicity, something like that. Predators develop the ability to consume things that are toxic, okay, or the ability to see things that are in camouflage. Lots of different ways that coevolution can happen. Symbiotic relationships where organisms are working in unison. And we talked about this before. Things like termites having beneficial bacteria that live inside their gut that allows them to break down cellulose. The bacteria can't live outside of the gut. The termite can't live without the bacteria, so you have a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so here you can see, just that pollination by bats. You can see that the rostrum, or the nose of this bat, is elongated. Okay, and it's not showing you the tongue, but the tongue is also long, so the bat can stick its head down into the flower. The flower is also adapted. You can see all these anthers. These anthers will put pollen all over the organism's head. The bat may have whiskers which can pick up pollen. Okay, and so it might be advantageous for the bat itself to pollinate more flowers. You pollinate more flowers, you have more flowers to visit, you have more of this cactus, this species of cactus around, and therefore you can have more meals because the nectar's down in here, and on and on and on. So kind of an evolutionary arms race. It's not like this individual is thinking about increasing the population of cactus, or this cactus is thinking about tricking this bat into consuming it. It just happens that mutations that are beneficial to this individual or beneficial to this individual are the ones that are passed on, and the ones that accumulate over time. The beneficial mutations accumulate. The non-beneficial ones typically cause the organism to be maladaptive or die without reproducing. Okay? In a symbiotic relationship, okay, we already talked about it, organisms live in relation to each other. Okay? Now there are lots of different types of symbiotic relationships. Some more beneficial to one organism than the other, like parasitism. In the case of parasites, one organism, the parasite, is benefiting at the cost of another organism. Okay? Mutualism, okay? And you get benefit at no cost. Commensalism, both benefit, or at least in some cases they both benefit. So there's lots of ways at which this can occur. So here you can see mutualism, an example of both organisms potentially benefiting. Okay? So this is some ants and some aphids. Okay? And mutualistic response here is that both species benefit from this interaction. Okay? Or at least superficially when we examine it, they both benefit. Okay? So aphids produce a little bit of what we call honeydew. Okay? And so they have little teeny flocculum that come off the back end of the aphid, and they excrete a sugary substance called honeydew. The ants consume this. Okay? So the ants actually farm aphids. Okay? So they'll get the aphids, and the ants will just crawl over the top of them, and they'll protect them from predators. So it's basically like the ants are milking these aphid cows. Okay? And they're getting all the honeydew that's coming from the aphids. The aphids produce it. The ants don't eat the aphids, but the ants protect the aphids from things like ladybird beetles and other things that would come in and consume the aphids. Okay? So that's a mutualistic point of view. Now, this is not mutualistic in the sense that they can't exist without each other, though. And these ants, the species ants, doesn't have to farm aphids. This aphid does not have to be protected by this ant. So in certain regions, the aphids exist just fine without the ant. The ant exists just fine without the aphid. But in other regions, they do have this, protection method plus the feeding method for the ants. Parasites, again, like I said before, one benefits to the harm of the other. Now, I hope you realize that parasitism is about one organism feeding on another organism, but it's not predator-prey. Okay? It's different than an organism killing another organism. In parasitism, the parasite normally does not kill its host. Okay? Normally, it just feeds off the host. Now, there are some examples when they kill the host, okay? Like, for example, parasitic wasps almost always kill the host, okay? Whether they're parasitic wasps on things like tarantulas or Lepidoptera, so caterpillars, and they lay their egg inside. The egg eats the organism from the inside out, or the larvae eats the organism from the inside out and then comes out. Okay, in those cases of parasitism, they do kill their host. Okay, but most forms of parasitism, most examples of parasitism, the organism just lives off its host for a little bit of time until it's got enough nutrients to reproduce, and then it will leave the organism if it can. Okay? Most of the time, the parasite is smaller than the host and, remains associated with the host for a given amount of time. So until reproduction, or maybe their entire life. For example, we have little teeny foccule mites, okay, that live in our eyebrows and our eyelashes, that live on us for our entire life. Okay? They're minute little teeny mites, okay, that almost every single person on the planet has them. Okay? It doesn't matter how much you scrub, you still have them. Okay? And you'll never know that they're really there. Okay? But they live off of dead skin or dying skin and maybe a little bit of blood here and there. Depends on the species. But they live off of us and we never know it. We're not losing a massive amount of energy to them. They're not causing disease, disorders, anything like that. In some cases, they do cause infection, but those are very rare. So nonetheless, we do have parasites that live on us constantly, okay, and are associated with us for their entire life. Now, some of you might have had a tick on you before that's also a parasite. It's going to take a blood meal. It's going to engorge itself, and then it'll drop off. Okay? Unless you just brush it off. Okay? But if it takes a blood meal, it would engorge itself till it got large enough and then drop off. Okay? So in some cases, parasites will live their entire life cycle with you, or entire life history with you, or another organism. And in other cases, it's just for a quick blood meal, and then they'll drop off and mate or whatever and find another host. Okay. So there are some different parasites out there. Normally we classify them in three main classifications. Either a parasite is considered an ectoparasite. It means that it occupies the external surface of their host. So like a tick, mosquito, focule mites, chiggers, lots of things that can occupy our outer bot flies, these kind of things can occupy our outer surface. Okay? So they live on the outer surface, etc. You have internal parasites, which we call endoparasites, and they'll often feed on the internal surfaces of their host. So things like tapeworms, liver flukes, gut flukes, okay, these kind of things live inside of you and have a different kind of life cycle. And then the final one is brood parasites. Okay? And brood parasites are a little bit different. They don't consume bodies, but they consume resources. So a brood parasite is a good example, is an example of birds that will lay their eggs in another bird's nest. Okay? And so they will take the other bird's eggs out, or maybe they'll cover them, they'll eat them, they do lots of different ways to do it. Then they drop their own eggs in, and they make another bird raise their young. That's a brood parasite. Okay? Now, there are different forms of this, and some people probably know humans that are brood parasites. Like, they say they can't take care of their kids, so they pass them off to their parents. Or they say they can't take care of their kids, and they pass them off to their siblings. Okay? Technically, I guess that's brood parasitism, but it's also, you know, they're not tricking you. Well, most of the time they're not tricking you. Okay? In this case, brood parasites, normally they trick the host. So the host actually doesn't know they're taking care of some other organism's offspring. They're just taking care of something. So things like cuckoos, they mimic the call of babies that they're laid in. So it's tricking the parents to keep feeding them. There's lots of different ways at which this can occur. Okay? Now, commensalism is interesting, and it's kind of hard to distinguish commensalism from mutualism, or mutualism from commensalism. So a lot of examples that we would say is a mutualistic relationship where both individual benefits are actually probably a commensalism benefit, or a commensalism relationship where one benefits and the other one's not hurt or helped. So things like, you know, clownfish, you know, laying their eggs in regions that have sea anemones or stinging sea anemones. The sea anemone itself gets really no benefit from the clownfish laying its eggs there. Maybe a little bit of benefit if it's defecating in the region and providing nutrients and things like that. But for the most part, there's really no benefit for the sea anemone, but there's a benefit for the tropical fish in that, you know, their eggs are protected by this stinging structure or stinging creature. Okay, and there's lots of examples that we see of, you know, organisms that will benefit that come to really no hurt or no help to the other benefit. And, you know, you see like feeder wrasse, little teeny fish that feed inside a shark's mouth and pick food chunks out of the mouth and things like that. That's an example of commensalism. The shark actually doesn't need to have its teeth cleaned. Sharks lose their teeth constantly, so they're not having cavities or anything like that from food being left in their mouth. Does it come at a cost to the shark? Probably not very much. There's not much energy benefit of a little teeny bit of food that's stuck in your teeth, but it comes at a huge benefit to the feeder wrasse because now they can, get a food meal that's, big enough to supply them energy. So there's lots of kind of examples of that. Okay? And like I said before, there's really no clear cut between commensalism and mutualism. A lot of times we'll say something is mutualistic, both individuals are benefit, but it's actually an example of commensalism. Sometimes we say it's commensalism, but we don't know, and it's really a benefit to the species that we're saying that doesn't get hurt or doesn't help. Okay? So there's really no clear cut between those two, and it can be hard to distinguish them unless you know a lot about the species. All right, so back to predator-prey. Predators consume another organism. Okay? The interesting thing a lot of times, and a lot of studies have indicated that predators are really good at just consuming all the prey species and then starving. So a lot of people, especially in the region of Yellowstone, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, will say things like wolves kill for fun. Okay? This is not the case. They're not killing for fun. Okay? They're killing because that's what they do. They are predators on prey. And so they will kill and they'll engorge themselves until they become full. Okay? And then they'll leave the rest of the meat, and scavengers will come and get it. Okay? But they would kill everything in a single area if they can. Okay? And it's just the way at which predation or predators are set up. They will kill everything. Humans are good at this. Okay? If you remember the passenger pigeon, okay, we killed them all just because we could. Okay? And a lot of them laid on the landscape and decomposed. We killed bison just because we could. Okay? We've killed fur seals. Okay? We've killed, numerous things just because we can. Rabbits, okay? Fox, predators that we're not going to eat, okay, and really have no harm to us, not doing anything to us. Okay? We've wiped them off the planet or out of regions just because we can. Okay? So often predation is just this distinctive response to kill that because you've killed it before, and it will provide you a little bit of resources. And so often this is the case. And that'll really give us an idea of population cycles. Okay? Because predation is so extensive and such a high pressure, you can get these cycles, these situations where predation, the predators will literally eat every single prey source, okay? Or at least kill every single prey source that they can find to cause that prey source to crash. And then the predators will starve and they will crash. Okay? And that's what brings us to this lynx-hare cycle where these predators, you can tell, the lynx are way up here. These predators don't have to eat that many, the snowshoe hares up here, the lynx is down here. Predator doesn't have to eat all these, but it does. Okay? And so maybe it doesn't eat them, maybe it just kills them. Okay? The population will crash, the predator will crash. Okay? And you get this cyclic event back and forth, back and forth. Okay? All right, so with that, I'm going to leave you. That's the end of community ecology. Okay? And next we'll talk about behavioral ecology and behavior, okay? And how some things avoid predation, or how some things avoid parasitism, or how some things allow for parasitism, how things sexually mate or do have sexual behaviors to attract mates, and a lot of other behavioral mechanisms that are out there.